Welcome to this week's rant. And unfortunately, again, it's not Sunday morning. This is being pre-recorded because of what's going on around us at the moment. And maybe I'll tell you what's going on, which causes it to be pre-recorded at some point in the future. However, before we start, normal parish notice. So, if you found the channel and you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. If you want to be notified when new content is added to the channel, hit that bell icon. If you want to support the production and the channel in general, head over to Patreon. It's a small amount of money. That's www.patreon.com/TheMusicTechGuyUK. The address will appear down here. All funds are directed towards the production of videos for this channel. And finally, in this era of coronavirus or COVID-19, depending on which way you look at it, remember, stay at home, stay safe, wash the pinkies, and we will get through this. Unfortunately, some people will be more scarred than others, but we will get through this. So, this week's video is entitled the SY85. Which is a Yamaha machine dating back from 1992. And it's actually this machine that's on the bench, and there will be an overhead shot of this in a sec. But I thought I'd run through the sort of like the preamble and the scene setting doing it this way. So, if you think back to the late 80s and 90s, the synth manufacturers were effectively transitioning from sort of the analog machines to the digital machines. And we had sort of a kind of a digital revolution going on. We had, prior to this synth being put to market, we had the D50 and the D range. We had the M1 and then the T range from Korg. And then Yamaha sort of came along with a group of synthesizers, which they called the SY range. And this is one of those synthesizers from the SY range. And there were a number of synthesizers sort of under this sort of whole SY umbrella. Some of them didn't have the SY lineage to them. They actually had a TG lineage to them. Hello. It is rather warm. So a beer has just been provided by one of the housemates. Anyway, they had this TG, but effectively the TG was a rack mount version of the equivalent SY synthesizer or SY keyboard. So there were a number of synthesizers in this range. So there was the SY22, which was released in 1990. There was the TG33 that was also released in 1990. Then there was the SY55 and the TG55 released in 1990. Then we had the SY77 and TG77 released in 1989. So that synthesizer was actually released a year before the lower models. Then we had the SY85, which is this one. That was released in 1992. And the last of the SY range is the SY99. That was sort of the monster synth that Yamaha produced at that point in time. And that was produced a year before this one in 1991. So as you can see from the lineage, you know, we jump around from 1989, which is when the SY77 arrived, and I can remember the SY77 arriving. Again, an anecdote. I went over to, I think it was, I think City Music had gone then, and it must have been Project Music in Hounslow, which is where I lived in West London, and they had the Yamaha 77, the SY77 sitting there, and the guy was bouncing up and down and raving about it, because at the same point in time you also had the D70 came out, and the guy, Project Music was predominantly Roland, actually, as I remember at the time. They were very, very heavily Roland, but the guy was bouncing up and down about the SY77 arriving. I just seem to remember that. It's, you know, it's one of those memories that you have for a canny. Probably around about then I would have been an 18-year-old with my mate, who we went over there to have a go at it. Anyway, I digress quite a lot. However, two of these SY synths aren't really SY synths. They've got an SY prefix to them, and it's kind of sort of like what Roland did really with their D series. So you had the D5, the D10, and the D20 that sort of shared a sort of common lineage, if you like. Very powerful machines. The D20 was a very powerful workstation, but it doesn't get the recognition it should have done. Then you had the D50 and the D70, and at the same time you also had the D110. And the U20 came out as well with the U220 and the U110. So there was a bunch of sort of synths and modules that came out around the same time, purportedly being the same lineage, but they weren't. The 5, 10, and 20 were pretty much the same lineage, just got more powerful as they went up. So you ended up with the 20 with the 3.5-inch disc on it, etc. The D550 had no, apart from the fact it shared the same D sound, but you couldn't swap sounds between the two, and the D70 was a completely different machine as well. Well, Yamaha have done something very similar, but I mean, most of the keyboards here are actually based on the same synthesis idea, even if you can't swap sounds with them. So the two that are odd here is the SY22 and the SY85. So the SY22 actually is an Yamaha synth. I know it says Yamaha on the box, and it was produced and it was sold by Yamaha, but really the SY22 was a sequential circuits box. So back around sort of the late 80s, early 90s, sequential circuits ran into problems in terms of financial problems, and they were bought by Yamaha. I don't know whether they bought them out of bankruptcy, whether the company had gone bankrupt, but Yamaha effectively bought the sequential name and the sequential IP. And they'd been working on this sort of brand new vector synth for sequential circuits, and it was almost complete. So Yamaha finished off the R&D with the sequential guys who came across from sequential circuits, repackaged the box, and effectively called it the SY22. So that's where the SY22 came from, not from Yamaha whatsoever. It came from sequential circuits. So if you're looking for a sequential circuits box, that was one of them. And the second machine that didn't really fit this, what I should say is the reason why the SY22 doesn't fit this is because it's all about vector synthesis, not about FM and AWM, which is what the other synths are about. So the second machine that didn't really fit this sort of FM frequency modulation, or AWM, which stands for Advanced Wave Memory Mechanism for Generated Synthesis, and the subject of this video is the SY85. So the SY85 as a keyboard actually has no FM synthesis capability at all. Okay, so Yamaha's sort of fledgling, well, I say fledgling, it's probably the wrong word, isn't it? Yamaha's FM synthesis, which it's sort of kind of built its reputation on through the DX series, doesn't appear on this synth at all. So the 55, the 33, the 77, the 99 all have their roots in FM synthesis. This does not. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's the first big major difference between this and those other SY synthesizers. This generates its sounds purely using AWM, and the Yamaha marketing team got involved and they moved it from AWM to AWM2. Okay, I have to be honest and say I can't tell you what they improved. I suspect it was the bit sampling rate of the samples that they used to generate the waves. So this synthesizer effectively is using a basis tone generation, which we called around that point in time PCM, or which was pulse code modulation. So effectively you would do a sample, that sample would form the basis of the synthesis, and then you wrap around the edge of that synthesis other digitally configurable items, so digital envelopes, filters, effects, etc. You wrap those around the original wave that was the original sample that was the wave, and that's how you generate your tone. So you're not generating your tone purely off an oscillator, as you might be on some of the other keyboards of the time. Now, Yamaha called this AWM. Roland called it LA, and Korg called it AI. They all work differently, okay? So don't, when I say this, don't shoot me down, because they all do work differently. But the principle that they all work from is pretty much the same. You start with a predefined wave and you digitally modify it. Okay. Now the way they work is different, but the principle is the same across all three major brands. And in fact, I probably would say that the AI, Korg's AI and Yamaha's AWM are very, very close in the whole architecture piece. And the reason I say that is because, of course, I think at this point, Yamaha still owned Korg. So, the SY85 is the last of the SY machines to be produced by Yamaha. So this was produced a year after their monster SY99. And it landed in the musicians' laps in 1992. And if you look at this synthesizer, so now's the time where I'm going to swap to multi-cameras. So I quickly swapped to 2 cameras now. With there's a camera overhead here, hopefully giving me a shot of the keyboard. Now, one of the things you note when you look at the SY85 is how similar this machine looks to the 77 and the 99 in terms of the way the machine is actually laid out. So all of them have the Yamaha motif up here, they have the big graphic along the back, they have the disk drive in a moulding that's over here on the left hand side, they have the modulation and pitch wheels, and for the 99 and the 77 there's a third wheel there. But in essence, the actual sculpting of the machine looks very similar from a case perspective. And that's probably about where the similarities end, really. So this thing has no compatibility with the 99 or the 77. Okay, so if you generated tones on either of those two platforms, other than importing a pure wave into this thing, you can't go and get a 77 cartridge and stick it in the data port and the waveform port and try and sort of use it. There was no compatibility whatsoever. Whereas a 77 and a 99, you can use 77 data on a 99. There was an intended upgrade part there. But for this, not a sausage. So it really is a standalone synth at either end. So at one end, the 22 was a standalone, and the 85 at the other end was kind of a standalone as well. Now I've got this machine switched on. I'm just going to switch it off and reset it, and switch it back on. When I acquired this synth, it was acquired with the comment excellent condition and full working order, and the reality is it's not. Hence the reason why you've seen a series of videos about the SY85 and me restoring it, because of all the things that were actually wrong with it. And there are still a number of things wrong with it. I'll come back to that in a minute. So how would I describe the SY85? Well, if I'm brutally honest, what I would say about the SY85 is it is actually a Roppler more than anything else. It's probably more than a Roppler because you can edit the sounds, but its basic principle is it starts as sort of this wave concept. Now, the basic stats on this machine, if I'm honest, are it's 61 keys from there to there. So it goes from sort of a, what's that, low C there, mid C there, C4, so it goes from C2 up to 5, 6, 7, C7. It has 30-note polyphony. Now, if you look on the internet, certain sites list it as having 32-note polyphony, and that is incorrect. It doesn't have 32 notes, it has 30 notes polyphony, unless, and I'll come to the unless shortly, but this is a 30-note polyphonic keyboard. You can actually have 16 concurrent voices generating, so that's 16 concurrent tones, voices, whatever you want to call them nowadays. So, and of course, every time you hit the board, so if you have 16 being generated on one single key, that takes up 16 notes of your polyphony. Okay. But the 16-note generation is kind of in the Yamaha describe, and I'll read it out, dynamic voice allocation mode. But in normal modes, the keyboard really operates with 8 voice generation. Okay, so it only operates with 16-note generation in a certain mode. Installed within this is 6 megs, and remember this is 1982 when this came along, so that's 6 megs of waveform data is actually stored on the machine, and then you can up the amount of waveform data, and that 6 megs is ROM, so that is non-volatile memory. It's there all the time. You can then up this with some memory upgrades that take it from 0.5 or 512K of volatile memory, as in it loses that memory, up to a further megabyte of non-volatile memory and 2 megs of volatile memory, which gives you 3.5 megs of memory on the machine that you can actually put loaded samples into. So you load them into the machine via one of the mechanisms. And just to give you an idea, this is still yet to go into the machine because I haven't got around to that bit of the restoration. But this is the 1 meg, 2 sticks of non-volatile memory. So this will take this up to 1.5 megs of non-volatile memory, and then there are actually 1 megabyte sims already in the machine when I got it, so that means it's fully expanded into the 3.5 megs that the stats say. There are on this machine 256 stock sounds, okay, and they are divided into 4 banks of sounds, and you access those by going into voice. And voice play will effectively give you access to those sounds. So this at the moment will be bank 1. You can change the banks. Oops, probably not like that. But you can change the banks on this so you can play different voices. So each bank of 4 has 64 voices in it, and that's referenced by this 8x8 matrix on this side of the keyboard, which gives you access to those 64 voices. If you go into performance mode, you get 128 patches available to you. They come from the internal and the internal memory here. Each one of those carries 64 patches. And again, once you're in one of these modes, effectively you select the patches by recording them through that bank of 8x8 buttons there. So that's your 64, and that's how you quickly get access to them. There are other ways of doing it, but that's the primary mechanism for getting access to the machine. If you have a performance, so one performance patch, so one of the 128 can have 4 voices attached to it. So very similar to the way that all the other manufacturers were doing it around the same time. They just used different terminology, but the mechanism was per se the same. So that's the general structure of this thing. Now, over here, you'll notice there are some buttons that say sequencer. So this comes with a 9-track sequencer, which I have to be honest and say is pretty versatile. We'll come on to that in a minute. The sequencer itself has a dedicated drum track, so there is one of the tracks in the sequencer was dedicated to the drums, but that gives you 8 tracks for voice, so for putting data down. And the sequencer itself is a pure note sequencer, okay, so it's not a DAW, it's a pure note sequencer, but it is fairly functional in allowing you in what it will allow you to do. So in terms of how long is it, it's about 1 meter long. It's just over 1 meter long, and it's about 35 to 40 centimeters wide that way. So pretty much sort of what you'd expect for a keyboard of this age and this era. And if you were schlepping this around as the roadie, this would be about 14 kilos out of the box. But of course, as soon as you put it into your flight case, which all my keyboards live in flight cases, and the flight case is actually down here on the floor. Oop, down here. So this thing here, oops, is probably around about, I don't know, 6 or 7 kilos, I suppose. Clonk, clonk, bang, bang. So in total, you're probably talking about 20, 25 kilos type touch if you're schlepping it around, which actually wasn't too bad for a machine of this standard. So if you were to get into the sort of the whole editing piece, obviously you've got the 6 mega RAM is full of wave data. There are actually 244 waves on this machine. Okay, so the machine itself comes with 244 waves that you can use as the basis of a tone or a voice, if you like, and then you can effectively copy that wave into somewhere else, and you can basically build up your own voice from that wave. And as I said, there are 244. They're split into 16 wave groups, and I can probably show you the 16 wave groups because I actually have them in the official Yamaha SY85 brochure. So this is the marketing material that came at the time, and I will pop this up there, I think, if I move out of the way, onto screen. But there are all the wave types, and one of the interesting things about this is it sort of runs from acoustic pianos as a wave type, of which there is one wave in there, and then it goes up to other keyboards, and there are 23 of those: brass, wind, strings, a guitar, e-guitar, bass, folk, synth. There's a good few synth in there, starting to 97, so that's 97 to 127. That's 30, isn't it? So there's nearly 40 of those synth pads, etc. in there. Going on, there's T percussion, drums, percussion, SE, which I'm not sure what they are, and then pure oscillator forms. Okay, and there are actually 24, 25 pure oscillator forms in here, going for sort of analog saw, pulse, digital, digivox, triangle, sine waves. So there are a number of waves in there to allow you to start generating your own tones. And I haven't done very much of this because it hasn't been working. But I did want to do the video. So when you pick a wave, effectively, so you're talking about the starting of the generation of the sound, which is the attack. Then what you then do is effectively you've got 22 predefined envelopes on the synth to actually push that signal through. So obviously we're talking about attack, sustain, etc. So there are 22 predefined envelopes on this machine that allow you to either just apply an envelope and say I want it to sound like that, or there are, depending on which envelope you choose, varying degrees of editability over the envelope that you can actually put on the machine. So from that perspective, it's very versatile in terms of allowing you to very quickly sculpt a sound. And as I say, depending on which envelope you pick, you get varying degrees of editivity over that. So one of the envelopes is a full. You can vary every parameter. Other envelopes have certain parameters locked down to give it its feature. And then once you've effectively got your envelope, got your sound generated, and it's sounding, the right length, and it's decaying correctly, etc., then you can then put the sound through 16 filters. So again, the filters themselves range from filters that have no editing capability to one of the filters where you can basically edit every parameter and varying degrees between the two. So you effectively, there are predefined filters that say give it this sort of sound, bang, hit that, you're away, and you've got very limited editing parameters there. So then that's your voice. You've generated your voice. You've generated how it's going to sound. Great stuff. And then Once you've done that, there are then 90 effects that you can then put onto that sound. And effectively, you can have two effects running at the same time. There are two effect processing chips within this machine. So they went for two effect processing chips and they processed two the signal at the same time. Now, I believe the effects are either applied to the voice or they're applied to the performance patch. I don't think you can apply the effect to the voice and then the performance patch. Or I'm not sure whether you can apply the effect to the 4 voices in the performance patch individually. And again, I haven't been able to test that out yet because I've only just got the damn thing up and running. So you will bear with me on that. It will come up. We'll test that. All the internal waves can be supplemented by buying or generating your own waves on a hardware sampler, for argument's sake, in a certain format. You can save those down to 3.5-inch disc, pop the disc in there, and you can load that up into either the non-volatile or the volatile memory on this thing and start playing around and creating your own voices from them. Alternatively, you can take a SysX dump through MIDI. It allows you to do that. Again, that was another feature. I've still got to learn how to sort of do the SysX from this machine to another machine, but effectively you can do that, and I will do that before we actually do the battery replacement, which is another one of the projects on this, because the battery is coming up as low voltage change battery. So another one that needs to be done. In addition to that and SysX, you also notice that there are 2 card slots here, and these take and I haven't got it here. It's obviously on the other side, on the other workbench. These effectively take 2 cards, so you can either put a memory card in, and a memory card will hold 128 patches and 256 voices. Now, given that the memory cards themselves are called MDC64 and have 64K of memory, I can't really see that you can have the waves to support 256 voices on the card as well. That kind of doesn't resonate with me because, obviously there are 244 waves in this thing, and it takes 6 meg. And we've got a memory card with 664K. So it's obviously the registration data of the voice, of how the voice is constructed, but it must use a wave that's already either on the 6 meg of ROM that's in this thing, or the non-volatile memory that is also on this thing. So somewhere in there has to be the wave that the memory card accesses. Or you can buy sets, and the sets come effectively with the waveforms and the registration that go into the waveforms, go into there, and the registration data goes into there. And you have to buy the sets together. Now, again, I haven't got any of these sets, so I can't verify a comment I saw on the internet a couple of days ago, which said that you could take a waveform off the card, put it into volatile memory or non-volatile memory, and you could then use that as manipulation to create a voice. I can't verify that, so I'm just putting that out there. It's one of those things. So most of the editing on this synthesizer is actually done through these sliders here. Okay, and there are 8 sliders here, and they're all multifunction, and you see them referred in the manual as CS1 through CS8 in terms of what they do. And effectively, like a lot of the other synths around at the same time, effectively the parameters come up in the LCD, and you then use these various sliders, or you could use the data wheel, of course, to change what it is you're looking at. So at the moment, the data wheel, if I whiz through the data wheel, is looking through all the performances within bank 1 of internal. So you just scroll through them like that. Okay. Had to stop because my mouth was getting dry because I've been talking. The next part of this is we come to the sequencer, and I said I'd come back to the sequencer because it's quite important where this sequencer is. Now, a lot of the sequencers on the machines around this point in time are pretty proprietary in terms of you could exchange data from the sequencer on one machine to the same machine or the same series of machines. So for argument's sake, the T series of the time, you could take data off the sequencer on the T series and you could put it onto a T2 or a T3, or if you were using stock sounds, you could actually probably load it onto an M1 as well. So there was interoperability between the actual vendors' key machines at the time. What you couldn't do is you couldn't take the data, the sequence data, and put it on a hardware sequencer. Or you couldn't record on a hardware sequencer and load it onto the sequencer on the machine. Now, this machine, you can. I haven't got any hardware sequencers to actually allow me to test this, but by all accounts, what you can do is you can actually do, so if you had a Yamaha, the name escapes me, Q is it? It's a Q series, isn't it? If you had a Yamaha sequencer, you could actually take the sequence off that Yamaha sequencer, and this thing will read it and allow you to actually store it. So you could take the notes data and store it in here and then assign to each one of the tracks, assuming it hasn't got any more than 8 tracks. You could assign the tones from this particular machine, and you've got the sequence already loaded into the machine. I think that's a pretty good feature for a machine of this age, I have to be honest. Now, the sequencer generally is 20,000 notes, of which 8,000 notes are ring-fenced as percussion or the drum track. Now, what I said earlier on was this keyboard is 30-note polyphony, apart from when you're using the sequencer. Because when you use the sequencer, and I don't know why, but when you use the sequencer, this machine becomes 32-note polyphony. And I suspect it has something to do with the drum track. I suspect those additional 2 notes are something to do with that 9th drum track. So just to recap, it's 9 tracks, 1 is dedicated to the drums, the other 8 tracks are voice tracks that you can generate off the machine itself. So I think that's probably why it is goes from 30 to 32. But in normal operation, it is a 30-note, not what they say on the internet about it being 32 notes. And the other thing about this is in terms of the way it works, is it splits songs into 10 banks of songs. Now, you can either have one really long song that takes up the 20,000 notes, or you can have a series of songs that take up chunks of the 20,000 notes. Or the other way you can use this is you can actually use much the same as, say, for example, a Genesis long song, where there are different scenes within the song. You can actually set the sequencer up on this to work that way. So each part of the song you can generate as a scene, you can modify that scene, and then this will actually roll through the songs to effectively create one big long song. But if you modify one scene or one of the songs effectively on this, you don't upset all the others, which you can do if you have a really long MIDI or a sequence of events stored as one song. So that's, again, I think a really cool feature that probably we didn't get into until sort of like modern day DAWs started sort of dawning about 15 years ago. Now, this was probably the point where I should sort of sit there and do that. Okay, I'm not going to do that because I don't think at the moment I can actually give this synth its proper, a good enough demo of what it can do. Because what I can't do is I can't load any songs into it. Or I can't load any other sounds into this, because I haven't worked out how the SysX works, and I haven't got any SysX dumps for it. I'm sure there's lots on the internet I could go and find, but I haven't got any at the moment. I've got a bunch of discs for it that came with it, but I can't load any of the sound data off those discs. and I kind of loathe at the moment to play around with it until I can get the factory set back on it, in terms of modifying stuff, because I don't know what I'm going to change. And if I'm in the past, I've sort of done that sort of thing, hit a parameter, and all of a sudden everything stopped working. I have no idea what I've done, and I can't get the machine back to a sound to produce sound without loading the factory sounds back. So I'm kind of loath until I've got that sort of mechanism worked out. I'm kind of loath to play around too much with it until it's into working order. The disk drive itself, as I said, the disk drive is faulty. I have put a new drive belt in, and if you have been watching the channel, you should see it's probably not been published yet, but it's due to be published, which is sort of the restoration part 3, where I put a new drive belt. Unfortunately, the new drive belt hasn't solved the problem, so it means that I think we've got a core problem with the disk drive. And the problem with that, of course, is that Yamaha used a disk drive system that used 24 pins, so it's a proprietary disk drive, whereas a PC disk drive of around the same time used 36 pins. And there are forums on the internet, and I've read through those forums on the internet of how to convert a 36 to a 24 pin system, and I'm quite happy to do that. I don't really have a problem doing it. The issue is I've got to find the right drive to go into it to allow me to do that, which I have, and it's currently in Tokyo. Don't ask me what it's doing in Tokyo, because it didn't start in Tokyo, it started in Utah. So the other way the sequencer works, which is different from a lot of sort of workstations sequencer around this time, is the sequencer works on sort of rhythm patterns. So what I mean by that is you can effectively make a rhythm pattern within the system, standard 4/4 bump bump with the snare. You can make that in here, and you can store it, and then you can make a variation of that and store that, and then you can make another variation of that and store that. Then you can put a fill in, and you can store that, and you effectively build all these building blocks up. And then what you do is you insert those patterns into your drum track at the appropriate point, effectively building your drum track out of many parts, which, if you think about it, is how a drum machine works. So a drum machine, you do exactly the same thing. You create a pattern, you store the pattern off, and then as you're moving through, you hit the next pattern, and the next point, whether it be 8 or 16 bars or 4 bars, the drum machine will swap to the new pattern. Again, I think a very clever feature of a synth of this age. And the last point on the sequencer, which, as I said earlier on, was the fact that it can read this data from other machines. And it goes one stage further, actually, which I find interesting. So if you look at a lot of the hardware sequencers around this time, the ones from Roland and the one from Yamaha that I do know about, there's probably many others out there, they actually acted as master data recorders. So you could send sysx patches to the sequencer in master data record mode, and it would record the sysx from that particular synthesizer and put it down on the disk for you. And therefore, if you needed then to reload the sysx back to the machine when you're on stage, you got the disk out, you put it in your hardware sequencer, you said send master data, put this into receive, and it would then send them the sysx back to this machine, and this machine would then be back up and running. This machine will actually operate as a master data recorder. So you can actually send from other machines, you can send sysx down to this, put this into master data record mode, and it will write that sysx out the disk. Isn't that pretty cool? So there you go. This is my Yamaha SY85 that's currently undergoing maintenance and restoration. Hopefully, I'm hoping that will be here. I don't think it's going to be here this week. I think it will probably be here next week, as in the week after next. So then we can sort that out. It then needs this memory installing, which is a relatively easy thing to do. It then needs the battery being changed, and I have the bits for doing that. So I've bought, as with all Yamaha synths at this time, effectively what they do is they put the the batteries have solder tags on them, which basically means that you have to, every time you need to change the battery, you have to desolder the solder tags, and then you have to solder in a new battery. I've never been a great fan of that whole process. The other thing is that this synthesizer actually takes a slightly larger battery. So normally we would fit into these beasties the coin cell with a reference of 3. Now, so let me just check it. Do you know, I had my mind's gone blank, so I just sort of pull the thing out. Yeah, 2032. So the coin cell normally has a reference of 2032, which is a slightly thinner coin cell. Probably needs more. This is a 250, which means it actually needs a slightly deeper cartridge. So I've got the deeper cartridges. These actually came in from China because it's the only place I seem to be able to buy them. And the batteries came in from a little shop, a little supplier in Hampshire, which is where I live. So they're all good to go. But as with all things relating to this synth, there is actually a sequence of events you have to do with the battery change. You can't just whip the battery out, because if you whip the battery out, you will damage something inside. So there is a sequence. I have got the sequence written down. So when I do the battery change video, you will see it. And the other thing, of course, is when I do the battery change video, I've got to literally take all the guts of the machine out to get the board out, because the battery is on the master motherboard. But for now, SY85. Hope you enjoyed this. Live long and prosper, guys.